Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 88th New Social Environment. I'm Malvika Jolly, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between sculptor Martin Puryear and Jason Rosenfeld. We're also thrilled to have the extra special treat of having the poet Kwame Opoku-Duku here today, who will be reading for us today to close our program. So looking forward to that. Jason Rosenfeld is a professor of art history at Marymount Manhattan College. He was co-curator of a variety of exhibitions, too many for me to list, that have been featured at Tate Britain, the National Gallery of Art in DC, the Van Gogh Museum, and many others. He's also curating an exhibition to come on Andy Goldsworthy for the Yale Center for British Art. Stay tuned for that, 2024. He's a senior writer and editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail. Jason, take it away.
Thank you so much, Malvika, and welcome to everyone who is joining us today on a Friday afternoon. It is my great pleasure to be hosting a conversation with the Rail staff with Martin Puryear. It's actually incredibly exciting. His work is amazing. He's a fabulous human being, and we're hoping that you will enjoy this talk. Thanks to Martin for agreeing to do it, and also Jeannie in his studio, who has been indispensable in getting imagery, as well as Brooke Kamen-Rappaport from the Madison Square Conservancy, who has also provided a lot of great images for the talk today. I also want to thank Stephanie Dorsey and Grace Benjamin from Matthew Mark's gallery, as well as Malvika, Sophia, Charlie, JC, Nick, Fong, and everybody else on the Rail staff who's making this work every single day, 88 straight now we've been doing this. Martin was last interviewed for the Rail by David Levi-Strauss in our November 2007 issue. So it is time, I would say, for us to kind of reconnect with him and see what he's been doing in the last 13 years. And it's been a lot, as you will see. He is someone who does not need an extensive introduction, because I'm sure most of you are pretty much familiar with his work, but I should note that he is a recent recipient of the Getty Medal, which was announced in February and is to be awarded in September. He also, of course, received a National Medal of the Arts from President Obama in 2011. He was born in 1941 in Washington, D.C., and attended Catholic University, having been working towards a biology degree, and then changed to art. Interesting, we just, the last talk that I did, actually 2 talks ago, was with Njideka Akunyili-Crosby, who also was a bio art major. There's a trend there, something going on there. He then went after college to Sierra Leone, where he worked for the Peace Corps, and was introduced in a lot of different art makings, and also, of course, that culture of Western Africa. And then he studied at the Royal Swedish Academy of Arts. And he was there to do printmaking, but he found common interests with a sculptor who was teaching there, and it really seems to have changed his path. And then, of course, he did a Yale MFA, graduating in 1971. And this is a kind of trend that we've also had in these talks, artists who have gone to Yale. Myself alone, I interviewed Matt V. Levenstein and Njideka Akunyili-Crosby. And then this past week, we just had Dawood Bey, the great photographer, who also went to Yale. So that is, of course, a kind of industrial art academic complex, churning out wonderful practitioners. But maybe we'll talk a little bit with Martin about that. Martin, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Martin's coming to you live from Ulster County, New York, and I am in Suffolk, the windiness of Suffolk. It's not a beach day. So we're going to settle in here and have a really interesting conversation, I hope. I'm going to start the share screen and just to launch here, talking with Martin, and talk about, hang on one second. Go and talk about how I first met Mr. Puryear, which was at his house, but it was in in preparation of an exhibition that I co-curated with Stephen Hannock, who you see there on the left, painter, landscape artist who lives up in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And here's Martin and myself. And this is outside Olana. And it was a show that Stephen and I curated called River Crossings, Contemporary Art Comes Home, which was held in the bulk of 2015 and was an attempt to fill these great houses in upstate New York. At the top is Olana, which was Frederick Edwin Church's house, the great landscape painter. And at the bottom is Cedar Grove in Catskill, New York, which is a National Historic Landmark. Olana is run by the state of New York. Cedar Grove was the home of Thomas Cole, the granddaddy of American landscape painting. And we filled both of these historic homes with contemporary art by artists who were working in the Hudson Valley, who had a connection with the Hudson Valley. And it was through meeting Martin, who we knew that we were desperate to have contribute something, which he did, as you'll see in a second, to the show, that we met Tom Noskowski, who lives quite nearby. And Tom sadly died last year, 2019. And Martin and I had talked about this ahead of time. We wanted to dedicate this conversation today to Tom Noskowski, great painter, wonderful artist, wonderful person, lovely human. I get sad thinking about it. And Martin gave a beautiful reminiscence of him at an event that we had at MoMA just weeks before the country shut down. I don't know if you want to say a couple words, Martin, about Tom.
Well, he just was a friend for as long as I've lived here. He had lived here quite a few years before I arrived in the country, but we were hiking partners, I think, mostly. Tom loved to hike. He lived in the Hudson Valley area for decades, and even before he moved here, he had spent time growing up with relatives in the area. So he was very deeply in love with the Hudson Valley and the mountains, the Shawangunk Mountains and the foothills of the Catskills, and he knew the trails and the byways like the back of his hand. And but he was also, I think, an extraordinary artist and a very, very deeply human just a extremely human being, extremely human being, and great sense of humor. Something a lot of people don't know about him, perhaps, is that he made his living for a lot of years working at Mad Magazine before he finally retired, and then he began to teach a little bit at Rutgers and other places. But he's I think his longest stint as an employee was at Mad, and it kind of is a testament to his sense of humor, and maybe that's why he lasted there as long as he did. But he had an enormously interesting and wry sense of humor, and you can sort of see it in the expression in this photograph. So his passing is premature and a great loss.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So we first met Martin when we visited his studio in 2014. And here's a little view of the studio. And you can see there in the center, the maquette for a work that we will be talking about, Big Bling, which was in process at that time. And the tools of training, you were making all these little tables, I remember here, that are on the stools, sorry, that are on the table there. Mm-hmm. Lots of these stools. So Martin, would you mind talking a little bit about your time at Yale and the artists who might have impacted you? Because it's been really interesting hearing from Matt V and Njideka and Dawood about their experiences at Yale. I mean, Matt V is a Russian emigre. Njideka came from Nigeria and is Black, as is Dawood. They had, conflicted experiences, I guess, at Yale, but they found people who were sensitive and empathetic to them and their ideas, and it sort of launched them on their paths. And I know you were there in the late 60s and the early 70s. Interesting time to be studying there.
Yeah, it was, well, in academia, things can change overnight. When faculty changes, the whole tenor of a place can change completely. And that's not, that kind of thing can happen at Yale. Yale is a sort of a hothouse and a pressure cooker. It's close enough to New York that there's a lot of ferment. I was there during the Black Panther trials, Bobby Seale, and there was a lot of activity agitating for the release of the Panthers in New Haven. A lot of demonstrations going on. It's also the time that, for some reason, and I don't know who did it, but the art and architecture building was set on fire. It was a time of a lot of ferment, and the professor who was the department head in sculpture at the time, James Rosati, who was a wonderful man, and was suddenly very busy pursuing his own work. He had lots of commissions, so we had rotating acting professors coming in, and it was interesting to see the people who sort of rotated through during Rosati's absence. And I think one of the more memorable people, one of the more colorful people that I remember was Salvatore Scarpita. But we also had, Sarah came through a little bit. Robert Morris at one time was an artist in residence, or a visiting artist for a number of sessions. I think that's where I met Mel Bachner. It's where I met Christo. Quite a few people would come through. These are just people who came through for one day visits and talks.
Yeah.
Who else? Yeah, and I mean, the same kind of thing happens at all art schools, I guess. You get visiting people coming through. I felt my experience at Yale was I arrived as sort of an artisan sculptor. I mean, I work with my hands. I still can and do, although I've gotten busier, and I am happy to have assistants who do a lot of the work that I used to do all myself. Now I have help with the work, but I was very much a manual worker, making work, and it was a period of the ascendancy of minimalism and conceptualism. So a lot of the more, what you might call advanced colleagues in the sculpture area were thinking and planning, and the idea of that you would actually put your hands busy and make a work. A lot of my colleagues in the department were not making things, physically making things. So I felt something of an anomaly, and I think that in a way forged me, because I just kept doing what I knew how to do, and I came out of it without really becoming a conceptual artist or becoming a minimalist. What I remember though is feeling as though the department was in sculpture, which was at the time in the basement, not the basement, but the sub-basement, one level below the basement in the art and architecture building. And it was a space with a 7-foot-high ceiling. So it was a punishing kind of work environment for people working in 3 dimensions. It limited the scale of the work you did. It limited your ability to get work in and out of the studios. And it was not an ideal place to work. Since then, Yale has moved to much more commodious and satisfactory studio spaces for the grad students. But
that was the Paul Rudolph building, which was pretty new. You got there.
It was the sub-basement of the Paul Rudolph building, and it had been, I think it seems like it had been subdivided by the architects.
Yeah, they took it over.
Areas, because the architects occupied this beautiful atrium they had their studios around the atrium looking down into the well. And we were forced to go down 2 flights of stairs to get into that sub-basement dungeon at the very bottom.
Yeah.
And what struck me in those years was that it felt like there were blue-collar artists and the white-collar artists. And the conceptual artists and the minimalists who were getting work fabricated, I thought of in some ways as white-collar artists. And those of us who got our hands dirty and actually made things with our own hands, we were the blue-collar people. And I came out of the whole experience with that mark on myself, that I'm a blue-collar artist. I make my own work. I can make my own work. I know how to do it. I'm not ashamed of knowing how to do it. And that's been the, I guess, the path I followed ever since. So the other thing about Yale was that was the first time I'd ever lived with any kind of meaningful proximity to New York City. Mm-hmm. So I, for the first time after growing up in Washington, D.C., making an occasional trip to New York and living in West Africa for 2 years. And then, because I went to the Peace Corps right after college. And then 2 years after that, I spent in Sweden, in Stockholm, and then came back. And suddenly I was able to go down regularly to the city and see what was happening in the galleries for myself. And that was, and during my time at Yale, I was able to actually see what was happening in what was then the sort of center of the art world, certainly in the United States and in some ways in the world.
Right, right. Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. We're sort of developing a history of the Yale MFA program here at the Yale at the Rhode, but it's really interesting to hear about the way that sculpture was treated, and also that building is still occupied by the architects essentially. Mm-hmm. But I wonder also that so much of your work is a kind of sculpture that's so related to architecture. That feels like there's a little bit of bleeding in between the two there that might have actually been happening there, even if just by a kind of osmosis in a way.
Well, I think it's probably more the fact that I've always been a builder.
Yeah.
Make things. I mean, I assemble things. I put things together.
Yeah. And
I'm not a modeler as a rule. I don't mush around clay and plaster. Mm-hmm. And I occasionally will carve, but my main way of making my work is assembling parts into a whole. Huh. And you can see that in the photograph the first picture you put up of my studio, which has the maquette for the piece that was installed temporarily in the Madison Square Park, mm-hmm. Called Big Bling, and that's a scale model made in wood, and that was the model for which, or from which, we actually constructed the full-scale work in Madison Square Park.
So let's talk a little bit about some of these sculptures, and just to wrap up the work that you did for River Crossings. The piece that we installed in the exhibition at Olana, Frederick Church's house, was this one, Question, which I had seen at the Matthew Marks Gallery in their little viewing space on 22nd Street in 2014. And I want to note it's made out of tulip, poplar, pine, and ash. So a combination of multiple materials in this single work. And then here you are just talking about constructing forms. And here is a photo of Martin installing Question in the main room at Olana in Hudson. And I remember you saying that this was the first time you had ever seen one of your works on a carpet.
That's true. It's true.
And I remember you pretty much had where you wanted it to be set up and then just moved it a little bit and then it was perfect. Mm-hmm. So here's a before and after view of the main hall at Olana on the left, and then with Question in the center, and you could walk under it. You just had to be careful.
I never would have thought that this piece would end up in a space that felt like a parlor.
Right.
But it worked. It worked. It's a very commodious space despite the carpet.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a view out toward the Hudson, as I recall, and it was a majestic entry into the exhibition. But here you can see elements of the way the work was made. It's made from pieces of wood assembled together, and there is certainly a lot of carving involved, but it wasn't carved from a single monolithic block. It was first assembled from a number of smaller blocks of wood into larger chunks, and then those were in turn carved into the shape. It has a kind of the big curve that descends into the sort of spherical ball at one end. There's a slight curve to it, and it's a work that sort of curving arm has the cross section of a six-pointed star. So it's like a twisting six-pointed star, the trajectory that a six-pointed star would make if it were flying through space, right. and either originating or ending up on that globe on the floor.
Yeah, my playful analogy for it is if you ever messed around with Play-Doh and used those little screens that pushed the Play-Doh through it and made those long like strands, almost like pasta out of the clay, like Play-Doh, and you would push it through a star, and that's what's happened here. But it also then torques as it comes down and goes into the bulb there. It's extraordinary. And I love, this is something I want to also talk about as we go through today, the distinction between seeing the work in the more inert white box space of a gallery and then seeing it activated in a totally different way in this 19th century neo-Persian house, as Frederick Church called it. But that is something which we will see in a couple of your pieces. And I think of it as the distinction between, there's the trend of showing contemporary art against white walls and stark galleries as opposed to using dark walls or colored painted walls. And contemporary artists who we had in this exhibit many of them were sort of thrilled to have their works hung on painted walls, colored walls, which of course Chelsea galleries are it's so anathema to that whole sort of visual idea of contemporary art.
Yeah, well, in that respect, it's interesting that the exhibition that was at MoMA, one venue in Washington, D.C., took place in the original National Gallery building, the sort of the Greek Revival or neoclassical building. And it was precisely because the space that I was first shown for the exhibition, and it was a lot of work, 30 pieces, was a carpeted space within the East Wing. And I just said, this is not going to work. I mean, most of the exhibition would have been installed on industrial or sort of industrial grade, public space grade carpet. And it just didn't work. And so it happened that they were able to juggle their schedule, and the work was installed in the original National Gallery building, the West Wing, which had period architectural detailing in its moldings and door jambs and all and the floors, the kind of oak, quarter-sawn oak floors that were so redolent of the past. And it was a completely different experience to see the work in such a space. And it really, I was so grateful that not just that it wasn't on carpet, but that it was in that older, more august environment that I had known since I was a child. And to see my work there was quite extraordinary. And it really did, the contrast between the setting, the architectural setting, and the work was unique and priceless. And I'm so happy that I had that experience. All the other venues, the MoMA exhibition, the MoMA galleries, the galleries at the Museum of Fort Worth, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art were all, of course, the contemporary white spaces. open white spaces, white walls, very little architectural detailing. And so it was great to have one venue where I was able to see the work in a completely different way, and in a way where the work was a counterpoint to its setting.
Yeah. I was lucky to see the show at both MoMA and the National Gallery, and I completely agree with you. The National Gallery, Martin's talking about the East Wing, the Louis Kahn building, and Louis Kahn museums are notoriously difficult on sculpture, I think, because of the way that he organized them and the carpeting.
That's IMP.
I'm sorry. Yes, IMP. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm thinking about the Yale Center for British Art. Yes, the IMP East Wing building versus the John Russell Pope West Wing building, the older neoclassical style building. And it was wonderful to see those pieces in the old building. And in fact, I was there because I wanted to see your show, and I was scouting out the location for our Pre-Raphaelites exhibition, which was going to be there as well. So it's kind of interesting. Let me just show you, speaking of Washington, D.C., and if we can transition to talking a little bit about public art, the public works that you've done, and we'll look at a couple of these pieces and then talk about Big Bling, and then a new project in Oslo. But this work is called Bearing Witness from 1997. And we'll be discussing, when we move to the works in Venice, the idea of an engagement with politics and the social in your work. But maybe can you talk a little bit about this commission in DC?
Well, this was commissioned by the General Services Administration, which is a government arm that commissions art under their Percent for Art program with new buildings, new government buildings. And this was the new Ronald Reagan Center, designed by Pei Cobb Freed. James Ingo Freed was the architect for this building. He was the same architect who did the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And I think, unfortunately, we don't have a front view of this piece.
I only have these two views.
Yeah, so this is I would call this the back view. On the large view is the back view. And this was, I think, my biggest commission at the time. And it was built in a shipyard, a place in Rhode Island that designed, fabricated hulls for sailboats, metal hull sailboats. And it was made from bronze, but not cast bronze. It wasn't poured metal. It was made from bronze plate that was hammered into these concavities or convexities and welded over and stainless armature inside. And it's called Bearing Witness, and it stands in front of among the things in this Ronald Reagan building, there is a building flanking it called the Woodrow Wilson Center, International Center. So this building stands in front of the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it's just off Constitution Avenue and the 13th Street in downtown Washington, center of DC.
Now, a piece like this, and we understand you're not a figurative artist, but not an abstract artist necessarily either, sort of somewhere in between. But I love how so many of your works seem to take ideas from sort of common implements, tools, elements, and then turning them on their heads a bit or expanding them in scale. Are there any forms that you were thinking about when you were evolving this piece?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that the main view. I didn't look at these slides before, but you're looking at the back.
Yeah.
On the large view, and then you're looking at it in profile on the other view, and the front view, the one that you'll see when most people approach it, isn't shown, and it's an elongated. It's an elongated form that is something that I have admired in African sculpture, a very elongated face. Mm-hmm. So that unfortunately is not, I just have to talk about it because it's not shown here.
That's the Fang mask?
The Fang mask, yeah.
Fang mask from Gabon or Cameroon that you've used
Equatorial Guinea and Gabon.
Okay.
It's a very sophisticated kind of abstraction that was evident in the work of these people.
Hmm.
It's been highly influential in my sculptural practice.
Mm-hmm. So how would you then talk about a work like this one, which was commissioned by Brown University, the Slavery Memorial, which was installed in 2014. And people should know this is made out of granite, and not here, but that this is a two-part sculpture. It is the bronze form on the right, and then on the left is a granite stand with text on it.
Yeah. Well, there's a little story behind this, which is that Brown University, under the presidency of Ruth Simmons, undertook a study to look into the connection between Brown University and the slave trade. And the study made clear the very strong connection between the Brown family, some members of the Brown family whose fortune sort of provided the seed money for Brown to get started. And it revealed that much of this fortune was made in the slave trade. And Rhode Island, which is where Providence is in Rhode Island, is where Brown is located, didn't have a plantation economy the way that the South did. So it wasn't that that Rhode Island used huge numbers of slaves, and there was a slave-based economy within Rhode Island. But there's a plaque that talks about the importance of slavery to Rhode Island's economy, and I think, yeah, you can read it here. It says, Brown University's connection to the transatlantic slave trade and the world, oh, it actually cuts off, I can't see the top, but I think it says this monument acknowledges or recognizes Brown University's connection to the transatlantic slave trade and the work of Africans and African Americans, enslaved and free, who helped build our university, Rhode Island, and the nation. In 2003, Brown President Ruth J. Simmons initiated a study of this aspect of the university's history. In the 18th century, slavery permeated every aspect of social and economic life in Rhode Island. Rhode Islanders dominated the North American share of the African slave trade, launching over 1,000 slaving voyages in the century before the abolition of the trade in 1808, and scores of illegal voyages thereafter. Brown University was a beneficiary of this trade. Now, when I was asked to submit an idea for this acknowledgement on the campus, my first thought was the most important thing this thing should do is provide information. So I can make you a sculpture. I don't have a problem with that. But I think the main thing is that the story has got to become part of it, the actual history, the truth, because there's so much buried truth. And that really, in a way, is the theme of this work. It sort of suggests that there's a buried sphere or weight with a broken links of chain extending upward from it. And it was an interesting project because you're trying to acknowledge something which is a shameful part of the nation's history. You don't want to celebrate it. So one thing I did was I chose to use cast iron, which is an industrial functional material, rather than bronze, which is often a celebratory material for an honorific sort of material. And I had it made in an industrial foundry, partly. And so it is a cast iron piece which is meant to rust,
right?
And get a patina of age and use. And the one thing that I wanted to do, because the whole history is it drags one down. What I did was I made, if you notice the last broken link, those facets on the break are rendered in mirror polished stainless. so they reflect the sky. And it's the one element of this work that has some kind of redemptive or optimistic or uplifting aspect, I felt. So, and it's right inside the main gate as you go into the campus. I think it's a pretty interesting bit of historical truth that the university has taken on making public. And I think that things like this are happening more and more around the country, especially as we're seeing the kind of certain monuments, certain monumental traditions being put into question. And so it's I think we're living through some real evaluation of what we are as a nation. Interesting to see what happens as a result.
Have you found that in the wake of making this monument or this sculpture that you've been asked to do similar types of works, or people are seeking that kind of commission from you? I know Maya Lin, had a complaint to a degree that after the success of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, that's all people wanted her to be doing was war memorials.
Yeah, I fortunately, there are a lot of artists now working such that these kind of requests can be spread around and they don't have to go to one person.
Yeah.
And I have been approached, and I take commissions very, very judiciously because they take up a tremendous amount of time. It's not the main thing I do, but I do them occasionally, and I like the fact that rather than having your work sequestered away in a private home or in a museum or a gallery, they are in a place where the public can engage the work.
Yeah. And
that poses a completely different set of issues when you're making it, because your audience is literally the public. And you want to ask yourself, what does that mean to put this work in the world without an introduction, without so much as a context? And so it's a different set of issues.
That certainly was the case with Big Bling, which was in a very visible location here in Madison Square Park and installed in 2016. And then I think it was held over. It was there much longer than intended. Am I right? Through a couple seasons.
It was. Yeah. It was extended, and this is a work that was installed just before the last presidential election. And
a shot of it being put up.
Yeah, it's you showed the maquette of this in the very first slide. In my studio. It was designed, scale model was designed in my studio. And then from that, we had engineers took over and plotted how this could be built at full scale. It's 40 feet high, made from glued laminated curved timbers and plywood. And it was made industrially by a company that made glued laminated timbers for heavy construction, bridges and church roofs and framing and bowling alleys and things like that. These enormous curved structural timbers. So they took it on and built it. And it was built with the help of a firm called Editor-at-Large in New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia, who do digital enlargement or digital fabrication. And they took my maquette and enlarged it, and the engineers took over from there, and it was fabricated and brought to the site in pieces. One night, 2 semis arrived, and cranes, several cranes, and it was erected, bolted together, put in place. As you can see, there's a golden element at the top, a shackle. It's a piece of hardware in real life, at real scale, much smaller, of course, which is like a holding device, a lifting device, a restraining device. And I called it Big Bling because I gilded that shackle like a piece of very, very ostentatious jewelry. And the idea was the work was really meant to exist in New York. It was really about the urban density of New York, the stratification that exists in New York, the striving, the kind of compartmentalization, and then this kind of golden ring at the top, which functions iconographically as an attractor, as something that everybody is trying to grab as they, if you remember, in a merry-go-round or a carousel, riding around and you reach and try to grab the ring. This is the ring, and it's this amazing magnet that everybody's drawn toward, particularly in cities where there's this striving for wealth and signs of success, evidence of success, prosperity. And so it's really a kind of a diagram in a way of how I felt cities operate. Just the picture before showed it during construction.
Yeah.
Those are the parts, those are the sections that were delivered as it was, and you see the shackle in its crate off to the left.
Yeah.
So this was an industrial scale work, and strangely enough, it was a temporary work. It was meant to exist for the several month duration of its installation, its venue in Madison Square Park. Mm-hmm. And it, as you said, Jason, it got extended about 3 months. And then we were about to, we had arranged to have it recycled into some kind of playground equipment for kids. And it ended up, the last minute, Philadelphia put in a request to have it moved to Philadelphia. So it was installed in Philadelphia along the Schuylkill River in a park. It was there for about 6 months. And
this is still New York, sorry, but I don't have any photos of it
right.
in Philadelphia.
This is in it looks like the early fall on the left, yeah. And then it's winter on the right.
Yeah, it was wonderful to see it across multiple seasons.
Yeah.
The other public art project that it made me think of was Christo's, who you mentioned before, his gates in Central Park. And if anyone visited them, the first week it was beautiful, atypical weather in February and gorgeous sunshine. And then the next week there was a blizzard and you saw them in the snow, and it was marvelous to sort of see them in multiple conditions, just like these two photos of Big Bling here. And I threw this one in here because I couldn't resist, that it seems to resemble to me this kind of seated cat images, which are so prevalent in Egyptian art. This is one from the Walters Art Gallery. I'm not putting you on the spot, but as a cat person, this is what I thought of right away. The form of Big Bling, which is extraordinary, that curvature, sort of like a kind of curved vertebrae. It reminds me of my cats just standing there wanting something. But my cats have very toned down collars, nothing bling about what they're wearing.
Well, some people have seen a cat in it. Mm-hmm. Other people, oddly enough, said it reminds them of an elephant, which I don't see at all. But
I think they read that long form in the front as a kind of trunk.
Perhaps.
I agree with you. I don't see the elephant element.
Yeah.
People were asking in the chat, where is it now?
Yeah.
And the answer is North Adams, Massachusetts. You can go visit it. And here is how it was when I visited it last year. Maybe you could talk about this project. After it spent time in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, it moved more recently to North Adams, right by Mass MoCA.
Yeah, it's Mass MoCA is this enormous industrial complex that's been turned into, converted to exhibition spaces for contemporary art. And they recently acquired a spit of land that connects their exhibition campus, projects into the town, and they've turned it into a park. And so this sculpture was installed on the outermost end of this spit of land. In the photograph, you can see that under that bridge, if you walk under the bridge, the Mass MoCA complex is beyond that. And all the space between there and the sculpture has been turned into a park. And I think you have a photograph of a view of it. That's how it looks now with the new park landscaping and the mountains in the background. It's quite a spectacular spot for the work.
This is the North Adams Town Hall here on the right, and here's the structure.
And every time it's been moved, it has a different meaning.
Yeah.
As I said, it was really conceived as a work for Manhattan, because in my mind it relates to and sort of expresses the kind of energy and social stratification and the energy, the sort of intense, dense urban energy in Manhattan. But to see it move to Philadelphia in a bucolic park along the Schuylkill River, and then to see it here in a park on the edge of an old industrial town in North Adams, it just takes on a different meaning each place.
Yeah, and it just was taken apart and then re-erected. And I met the people in North Adams who I think had re-gilded the shackle for it.
Yeah.
So it's gleaming again, just like, sculpture, 19th century sculpture has to be re-gilded over time. It's actually it feels like it's facing the town, which is over here. So the hope from Mass MoCA was that it would encourage people to come Mass MoCA, but not ignore the town of North Adams, which has been a very depressed industrial town, and to come down to the main street and engage with the shops there and the restaurants, etc. There's another photo that Martin sent me here, which is from this past 4th of July, when they staged a reading of Frederick Douglass's writings. And the idea of this structure, which was so much about Manhattan becoming a locus for the community in North Adams, I find profoundly moving.
As you mentioned, the shackle was re-gilded in North Adams, and it's in fact 22 karat gold. Of course, very, very thin layers of gold. The shackle itself was made from fiberglass and styrofoam covered with fiberglass, and it was made by this digital atelier company I mentioned in outside of Philadelphia, from a model that I had carved in wood. And it was enlarged digitally to the scale that it is, and then milled out of hard foam, and then covered in fiberglass, made glass smooth, sanded glass smooth, and then covered with 22 karat gold leaf. So it is genuine gold, but infinitesimally thin layer.
So it's meant to be in North Adams for how long, Martin?
Indefinitely, I think.
Okay.
I think they're not looking to take it down anytime soon, and I think it's structurally could last for 3 or 4 years probably. The people who made it, the professional glue laminated timber fabricators, were shocked that it was a temporary work, because it's made from pressure treated wood. Everything on it is pressure treated, and it's made as though, and all of the fasteners in it, all the connectors are galvanized. So it's essentially quite a weatherproof work as far as wood structures go. So it could last for probably a decade, but it'll be checked for structural stability and safety at regular intervals.
Yeah.
If it does stay up for longer than a few years.
And I should note that the mesh is very small around it, so you can't climb it. There's no way really to climb onto it.
That's one issue that the folks at Madison Square Park had with the work, is that it could become what's called in the legal term parlance an attractive nuisance, where the work is just irresistible for people to try to engage in a way that puts themselves at risk.
Yeah.
And then it puts the owner of the property, or the person who made it, or anybody connected with it, in some kind of legal liability.
Right.
So that was part of it, and it also works with the idea of this barrier, essentially, that restricts access to the internal compartments.
even as it's porous, as one of the chat people mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, to move from a sculpture that's kind of temporary, it might last for a certain amount of years, to one that in the website for this work in Oslo states that it will endure for thousands of years, which I thought was a wonderful thing to put there about a sculpture. It will be there thousands of years from now. This is Creature from Idefjord, if I pronounced that correct.
That's right.
2020, just installed on June 15th in Oslo.
Yeah, it's a work commissioned by the Oslo Foundation, Savings Bank Foundation. In Norway, there's foundations that banks are required to spend their profits for socially good and cultural causes, and they commission sculpture around the country. And this was commissioned for a new city library, the new main library in town. And that's the Oslo Opera House in the background, a brand new landmark building. Not brand new, it's been there for at least 10 years now, but a spectacular building designed by an architecture firm called Snøhetta, who also worked in this country. They did the San Francisco MoMA, and they did the 9/11 museum building.
Downtown.
A very interesting architecture firm. And you can see just a corner of the library building looming overhead. That was the site for this for the sculpture. It's made from 44 blocks of granite. It's a kind of granite called Idefjord granite from a part of Norway not far from Oslo. And there's a fjord, a narrow, deep water course called Idefjord. And so the granite quarry is called Idefjord, and the type of granite is called Idefjord granite. So the name of the sculpture is Creature from Idefjord. And as you can see a resemblance to the Big Bling work, but of course, whereas Big Bling was very, very slender and planar and compressed, this work is flat on only one side. And the other side, of course, is fully rounded. And whereas Big Bling didn't encourage people to walk through the opening, in this work, one of the main goals of the work is to make a work that the public could engage, walk through the opening, and realize the two very, very different characters. This is looking at it from the rear, which is a fully rounded sort of form that kind of blends in and leads you through the opening. And you come out on the other side into a perfectly flat wall of uncarved granite. The broken area of darker granite is as you can see here, that's me working on the granite, cutting it away, making the transition between the carved area on the right, which is finished with a bush hammer tool, which gives a rough texture, but a smooth contour. And behind me is the area of roughly split granite, exactly the way it comes out of the quarry. And so we decided, because this particular granite, this Idefjord granite, splits so predictably and so straight, that we decided to use this naturally split surface for the facade that is the vertical straight facade, and treat the carved area with tools and leave the evidence of the cutting, and not try to make the entire piece treated with the same surface of tooled. So that's, and there you can see the opening behind me that you can walk through. You come through a rather sharp opening through the vertical side. And on the other side, of course, it's very, very rounded. I don't think we have a picture of the other side.
No.
Yeah. So you flow into the other side and come out very crisply through this side. It's, like I said, it's 44 blocks of granite, 135 tons, and the height of it is 7.5 meters.
Wow.
And it was made, again, made originally from a carved wooden model that I made in the studio. And I used some digital technology to make a file from it. It was scanned and it was made into a file. And that was in turn given to the stone people, and it was engineered from using the file to engineer the work and decide how it would be divided into blocks and how it would be constructed.
And the sighting of it here next to the library, and of course in Oslo, famed for the Nobel Peace Prize and these kinds of things, and this amazingly enlightened sort of generosity or forced generosity of the banks who make art or commission art for the nature. It couldn't be more different than what goes on essentially in this country. I wonder if your experience with this was very different from your experience with bearing witness in Washington, or do you see them as somewhat commensurate?
I think both are attempts to use certain government entities or official entities to support the arts. Mm-hmm. The bearing witness piece was done under the provision of the Percent for Art program administered by the General Services Administration in Washington. And I believe they still operate to commission art for public buildings.
Yeah.
It is the U.S. government, and quite bureaucratic.
Yeah.
Complicated by the official bureaucracy, but it I don't know. I think the support in both cases, as I remember, was quite good. I think the bearing witness piece was at the time the most ambitious and largest, and certainly the most well-supported, well-funded piece I've ever done up to that point. Huh. Here in Oslo, I didn't have to work within a budget. Once they accepted the idea of the work, they paid what it took to make it. And so I didn't get involved in any negotiations with the fabricator.
Right. It's interesting. One of my former classmates at the Institute of Fine Arts, Maria Safiotti-Dale, notes that Governor Scott Walker abolished the Percent for Art program in Wisconsin. And of course, our current president has stated that all public governmental buildings in the United States should be done in a neoclassical, or, well, he probably doesn't understand that, but a kind of classical style. So one hopes that this pendulum will swing back, and the kind of positive experience that you had in Washington is something that will become normal again in this country. Mm-hmm. I just want to move to one work, and then we're going to talk about Venice, because in a way, Venice, the project in Venice, is a commission that is a kind of governmental commission. But just to note this work, which I always think is one of your seminal pieces, Ladder for Booker T. Washington from 1996. And here's how you see it installed magnificently in the Tadeo Ando building in the museum, the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth in Texas. But I also wanted to give 3 images here of how I've also seen it, as we were talking before, at MoMA there in that impossible to fill atrium, which you did admirably with lots of other sculptures. And on the right in the National Gallery in Washington, DC, in John Russell Pope's West Building under the dome, which is meant to evoke the Pantheon in Rome. And extraordinary the way this piece sort of commands the space, no matter where you see it, I would say. Mm-hmm. But that idea of art and politics and citizenship, which we'll talk about in the Venice projects, is something which I think people associate with this work to a degree, but that's largely because of the title. but the title is, of course, something which was added later, correct?
In this case, it was, and it doesn't always happen that way, but I had been thinking of a way to make a work, and this is a kind of a schematic way of thinking about sculpture, but I was been fascinated with the idea of making a work that would operate in such a way that the perception of perspectival diminution would be confused for the viewer, such that you wouldn't be able to tell right away if the work in fact is going back in space, or if it's just because you've created a forced perspective,
right?
To put an artificial perspective on it, and that's something that's been done in architecture and design in the past. They have these kind of false lattice work, garden detailing and even interiors that suggest that you're looking down a long corridor. In fact, it's a flat plane. So the idea began there with the kind of idea working with a perceptual game. And once I had finished the work, it struck me that this whole notion of distance and misperception of distance, and I couldn't stop thinking about Booker T. Washington, an early civil rights, early Black civil rights champion whose idea of racial progress was what you would call today one of gradualism. That you would accept that you have to start at the bottom and prove your worth and work your way up, more or less. And his attitude would contrast with someone, say, like W.E.B. Du Bois or Du Bois, and who was much more of an analytical thinker, and who saw what we call today structural racism, which you really have to look at that and analyze it and figure out a way to attack that head on. And they're two different sort of almost competing attitudes of how to understand a social dynamic. And it just, the idea of Booker T. Washington's way of thinking just stuck. And that became the title of the work. And it's very strange. This work is one of the works that most people who've seen my work, they always remember this work among more than, I mean, most people remember this work to the expense of almost everything else. This is a work that's, there've been requests to use it for numerous applications in print, advertising. It's crazy how it's kind of caught in some kind of public consciousness.
You've created something iconic, Martin. That's it.
Well,
you have to live with it. Just like Michelangelo did, with the creation of Adam. It's honestly, it's a work which rises above, no matter where you see it.
Anyway, what it is, it's made from a gnarly ash tree,
right,
which is split in two halves.
That's the same ash which is threatened right now.
It's the species that is dying out all over the East.
Yeah.
The northern white ash, black ash, all of the ash trees are threatened and they're dying.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful tree. The wood is strong. The wood is beautiful. It's used for utilitarian things. It's used for furniture. It's used for flooring. And
used for baseball bats.
Absolutely.
Louisville Sluggers.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so this is the traditional way of making a ladder. If you go out in the country, you'll often see ladders made this way, where they would take a tree trunk, a sapling, and split it down the middle, and then put rungs in. And you see this way of making a ladder all over any kind of rustic communities all over the world.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, let's move to Venice and talk a little bit about your installation at Venice, and then we'll field some questions. How are you feeling? Got energy?
Still okay. Yeah.
Good, good. And here's a view of the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which was last year, May 11th to November 24th, 2019. This is the 58th Venice Biennale that you're seeing here. And I saw in the catalog that you visited the 34th Biennale in 1968 when traveling through Europe.
My first time to visit Venice.
Yeah.
And my earliest Biennale I've seen. And then I was in the Biennale just by accident. I went there for a visit to see the one in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
When Joan Jonas represented the United States.
Right.
And
do you remember what was at the U.S. Pavilion in '68?
I remember seeing a Noguchi marble there. And I don't know that I remember the artist who represented the United States. I was just looking at I was so distracted by everything that was there.
Well, someone will look that up, hopefully, from the team, because I didn't have time to look that up. So the overall theme of the 2019 version was, May You Live in Interesting Times. And Martin's pavilion was titled Liberty. And I encourage people to check out the catalog, which is fantastic. And here's a view at the main sculpture, which confronts you as you approach the pavilion, called Swallowed Sun, Monstrance and Volute, 2019, Southern Yellow Pine, Steel, Polyester, Canvas, and Rope. And I've just stuck here as comparison a monstrance, which is a implement from the Catholic Church, which would have held the host for the Eucharist. And on the bottom here is an example of a volute, 2 volutes on an ionic column, fluted ionic column. This is one that's actually in Greece at Olympia, but that's what you're seeing here on the left, this fantastic sculpture slash also kind of form of architecture, right?
Well, this entire project was a kind of engagement with the building, with the architecture. And I had the good fortune of working with Todd Williams and Billy Tsin, the architects, who agreed to sign on as exhibit designers. And we both saw the U.S. Pavilion. I hope we can get to a photograph of the pavilion itself without the work, because that's the starting point for everything I did on the show. Is it possible to advance to that? Yeah,
image? I can do that. Hold on one second. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, that's good.
Okay.
That's the U.S. Pavilion. And for people who haven't been to Venice and haven't been to a Biennale, in Venice, there's a certain area called the Giardini, the gardens, which has for years been a venue for international exhibitions of art and exhibitions of architecture. And the exhibitions of art occur in alternate years with the architecture biennales. And most of the major nations have a dedicated permanent pavilion, which they've funded and built and maintained for the exhibition of work by their artist. And this is the U.S. Pavilion, which was clearly designed in a sort of neoclassical or Greek revival style. I guess it's neoclassical, really.
Yeah, Greek revival, 1930s.
Designed in 1930 by Delano and Aldrich, and it's clearly a reference to a kind of architecture that really had kind of been had kind of taken hold in Washington in Washington D.C. The National Gallery was designed in the same style, as well as the National Archives and the Jefferson Memorial. And in this case, it involved these fluted Doric columns on the facade, and a very strange, it must have been an addition with this, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was that way in the beginning, but this sort of picture window on the right, which is a real anomaly architecturally speaking. But I found it very strange that we had, in 1930, we would build a Greek revival or whatever you'd call this style building to represent the United States. And it's clear, to my mind, it seemed clear that it was a reference to Monticello and to Jefferson. Jefferson was an architect as well as a statesman and president and farmer. He was a real polymath, and but he was a very sophisticated, cultured human being, and had traveled in Europe and had come back from Europe with his head full of ideas about classical architecture. And he designed his Monticello based on what he saw in classical architecture in Europe. The interesting thing about this is that Andrea Palladio, the Italian architect, had sort of elevated this style centuries ago in a series of villas around Venice in an area called the Veneto. And in Venice, he had done two major, I mean, Venice is full of churches and cathedrals, but he had designed two of the most important churches in Venice. So it just seemed interesting that this Palladian architecture was in Venice, built in Venice by an American architect in 1930. And it's just the kind of sort of echoing ironies in the whole thing. And there's inside that you can see there's a dome, and under the dome there's a starburst, or kind of like a compass rose design in the mosaic of the floor, and it's like a miniature temple. And it just struck me as
I can show that here on the left. Here's the dome inside the U.S. Pavilion.
Right.
And here's what Martin's talking about.
Yeah.
The interior, the starburst of the inner space.
So my first reaction to putting work and engaging this sort of miniature temple, because it's almost a folly. It's these sort of architecture details that you normally see in enormous buildings, and they're kind of miniaturized here in this little brick Jeffersonian building. It was not a building that attracted me as the place to put my work. And initially, I didn't want to put the work in the atrium in the center. I was going to have people come into the flanking galleries and avoid that. And I wanted to do something in the courtyard. Another issue was that, as you saw in the picture of the facade of the building itself, you have to go up, you have to negotiate 2 or 3 steps to get into the galleries.
Yeah.
And so thanks to the architects that I had as collaborators, we decided to raise the level of the forecourt so that you could walk into the galleries with no step. And we put a ramp, a very nice sloping ramp and steps to get to that level outside of the courtyard space. And I decided to make a lattice screen to sort of shield the facade of the building. And that's what this is. The title of this complex outside is called Swallowed Sun. And I have to say that it has to do with how I felt about the country since our last election. And there's this kind of glorious image from the outside of almost a flattened projection of a dome with an oculus. And inside, there's this kind of malevolent serpent's tail, which turned out to be something that was necessary to support the screen. We had originally thought to support the screen by tying it back to the corners of the building. The screen ended up being way too heavy to be supported that way, and the building, it turned out to be insufficiently robust to take that kind of buttressing. So we had to support the screen with its own flying buttress type element, which we made from steel. It's a kind of a curling volute or curling cone of framed steel wrapped with black canvas, and it was meant to be malevolent, to be this kind of serpent-like form. Don't want to get into it too much, but it just was meant to be not a salutary element.
Yeah, I mean, you have talked about how you never thought about yourself as a political or social artist, but you were troubled by the election, and this was a kind of response. I mean, I understand a number of the works that were in the Venice show were already in process when Brooke had asked you to represent the U.S., but this is one of the ones that was made in particular. And would you consider it site specific, this work?
Oh yeah.
So it's broken down. That's it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's an extraordinary form, and the way that it presents this facade. It is a bit like the serpent in the garden, you know, with a alluring head, who draws you in, the sunburst on the front, and then the sucking form in the back. And I'm interested to look at the idea of a volute, because there's the architectural quality, but aren't volutes also something which are used in plumbing or in tubes that are used in construction?
That I don't know. I don't know. I know of it as an architectural form, as a classical form. And you referred to the monstrance, which is that sunburst-like thing, which is a device in Catholic liturgy, Roman Catholic liturgy, to hold the host. And I thought that this sunburst form, the way that the flattened image of the dome with its oculus projected onto a flat plane, suggested something glorious from the outside.
Right.
And so
that's the promise of the American pavilion. And I also appreciate the way that it feels like it's a screen sort of barring entry, but actually, as you're discussing, it makes it easier for people to get into into the space.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see that you can walk up 4 steps to get to the level that you see here, and then you walk right into all the galleries, all 3 gallery doors. There's no stairs involved. Makes it very easy. And
also, go ahead. Sorry.
And this was done with a lot of negotiating, because these buildings that house the national pavilions are historical landmarks at this point, and really can't be altered. So we got permission to raise the level of the forecourt on the condition that it would be temporary. So even though we made what everybody agreed was an incredible improvement on the access, and on even the appearance of the building, it had to be removed afterwards. Tons of concrete, tons of gravel, tons of all the work.
Great. Well, I had a couple things that it reminded me of, wearing my art historian hat as ever, forms, which I'm not asking you to comment on, but the kind of things that I see a kind of visual affinity, but also, you know, you want to make we make these kind of comparisons, they have a kind of deeper meaning, whether it's the orologium, the great, I love the radiating forms in so many of your works. It always reminds me of the orologium, which was the great sundial that was constructed under Augustus in Rome, and which is now buried under layers of the city of Rome. It's in the Campus Martius, right by the tomb of Augustus, and the Arapakis, which you see here. but also forms like the disc of Aten in Akhenaten and works from the New Kingdom Egypt period when the rules were relaxed and Akhenaten was pharaoh, and then also these kinds of Horus imagery with radiating forms and discs. There's a wonderful kind of symbolic references there, which are not exact, but it's a way to think about time and power and these ideas of unfolding, which of course the Catholic Church also took on in the forms of its elements and its kind of rituals. So just a couple works, and then we'll move to the questions if you're feeling okay. If you want to talk about a couple of these works, Martin, from the inside of the pavilion, which relate to these kind of ideas which were fulminating at the time. And this one, Big Phrygian, this great form, which you see from two sides here, from the left side and then the right side, where you can see the folds in this form, painted red cedar, 2010 to 2014.
Yeah, these are, I think we're going to see a few images from the pavilion in the Venice Biennale.
Yeah.
This is one, and there were, and it's called Big Phrygian, and Phrygian caps are the emblems of freedom that were worn from antiquity. As you see here in this sculpture by Canova on the right, and this is a sculpture in the Accademia Museum in Venice of a man wearing a Phrygian cap. It's a symbol of freedom. And then you see the man wearing the same kind of a cap. He's a freed slave, and with an inscription under it, this engraving from, what does it say, 1790?
Yeah, 1790.
Engraving by Louis Boiseau, called Moi libre aussi, means I'm free also, a freed slave. Around the time, I guess, that France freed its slaves. They were re-enslaved at some point under Josephine, Napoleon's wife, reinstated slavery, certainly in the Caribbean colonies. In Martinique, there is a statue of Josephine in the harbor in Martinique with her head gone. That's one of the first sort of monumental destructive things that I've ever seen, was with her head was gone and she splashed with red paint. And I saw this, maybe 10, 15 years ago. So the Martinican people had their way with her. But anyway, this is the Phrygian cap. And so this was an enormous constructed replica of a Phrygian cap, which at this scale takes on a kind of a humorous quality, I think. But it is a serious, iconographically throughout history, it is a serious element, and it occurs a lot. Here you have a photograph of a painting by Delacroix of Liberty leading. I can't read the caption, but
Liberty leading the people from 1840.
She's wearing such a cap, and you see it a lot in French iconography connected to the French Revolution. You also see it in American iconography. You see the figure of Liberty sometimes wearing such a cap with the kind of crown flopped over the front. And you also see it in images of Punch in a humorous guise.
Right.
So,
that's right. The date on this should be 1830. But I also noted that the Phrygian cap is used as part of the seal of the United States Senate.
yes.
And also many Latin American countries have adopted it into their coats of arms. So it's quite an interesting symbol that is sort of passed down and turn it into this marvelous, and I agree, somewhat humorous kind of representation. It sits there on the floor. And that idea of, removing hats from their owners, and the idea of getting away from a kind of sculptural art which is based on allegory or personifications, and instead just removing the person and leaving us with the hat, is something which continues in these works here. Tabernacle especially. And here I should point out to everyone, you can see the swallowed sun and monstrance here through the windows that Martin pointed out in the forecourt of the US Pavilion. And this work here on the left is called Tabernacle from 2019. And in the last couple minutes, I just would like to look at Tabernacle and the column for Sally Hemings before we move to questions. Tabernacle is of steel and red cedar. As you see, there are multiple kinds of materials, and it's based on the form of Civil War caps that were worn by soldiers actually on both sides of the conflict in this country.
Actually, it's made from steel, and the black part of it is canvas, black fabric on the
right,
outside.
Stretched on it, yeah.
Right. And then the inside of it is a printed fabric from France, a historic pattern.
You can see it there.
Yeah.
So it's a extremely complicated sculpture, and it relates to, as you see here, this image by Winslow Homer of a sharpshooter wearing this kind of sort of semi-collapsed hat. And these photographs here of Black soldiers in the Union side who actually are holding musical instruments from the Civil War. And at the bottom, this image of this great siege mortar, which is also taking up the shape of a massive cannon that shot something like 13-inch wide cannon shot balls, and that could be moved on railway tracks by the Union officers. And you see that element in the form of the cap here in Tabernacle.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is the piece that is so encumbered with various kinds of imagery, but its message is very simple, and the text that was given out in the exhibition, we made a little brochure that we printed in huge quantity, and they were distributed to anybody who wanted them. And it did have a very concise description, which I'm going to, if I can, take a few minutes to read. It says, the steel visor and crown of Puryear's tabernacle generate an overall form based on a forage cap worn by the Union and Confederate infantry during the Civil War. Tabernacle contains a world within a world. Its black canvas shape suspended from a gridded exoskeleton, its interior lined with an early 19th century floral printed French textile. Viewers peer into the work's center through a glass window. Mullions in the window form crosshairs. Inside the hat's outsized crown, the artist has constructed a wood replica of a dissected Civil War era siege mortar with a mirrored cannonball-like sphere nestled in its barrel. Viewers are implicated. They see themselves reflected in the shiny surface of the globe. Tabernacle is Puryear's meditation on American gun violence, so often enabled through something resembling religious zealotry. A tabernacle is a place of worship, whether large enough to house a congregation or intended to hold a single icon. So it really is a response to the scourge of gun violence that this country is saddled with. And it's something that I feel really strongly about. And it's a number of things which have sort of welled up in my consciousness as I was working since our last presidential election. And a lot of these thoughts percolated to the surface and found life in the sculptures, which is not typical because I normally am not involved in reflecting on what's happening in society. But in the past 3.5 years, I've been very, very affected by what has been happening to our country. And so it's interesting that I would represent the United States at this moment with this work,
right?
Which is not typical of my work,
yeah,
as the whole span of my work, but only typical of my reaction as a citizen working in the past 3.5 years.
So where is this work now, Martin? Tabernacle.
It's with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you like to maybe place it somewhere where it could have a broader?
It will be exhibited, I think, this fall. I'm scheduled to have an exhibition this fall at my gallery.
Okay, at Matthew Marks.
Matthew Marks, yeah.
Great, so we'll all be able to see it then. Those of us who were not lucky enough to get to Venice, that would be fantastic. So let me just show you very quickly 2 more works, and then we'll move to questions. This one's called Hibernian Testosterone, extraordinary piece, which was hung on the wall in the installation in Venice, in this room with new Vortrekker from 2018, painted cast aluminum and American cypress, this inverted cross, this extraordinary image, which is a fossil, essentially, not a fossil, but it's a sculpture of an actual sort of a being or megafauna that used to exist, Megalosaurus giganteus, the giant Irish elk, it's called. This is one that was pulled out of a lake in Ireland a couple years ago. You see they're gigantic, something like 9 feet wide, that Martin used for this massive sculpture in the pavilion.
This was nearly as large as they get. And this was made from scratch, modeled in this is rare for me in that this was modeled, a work that was modeled. I acquired a replica skull to start with, and from that I modeled the antlers and attached them to the skull, and then the entire thing was cast in aluminum and painted. So it's a cast aluminum sculpture, and it is in fact as a replica, as lifelike as I could make it, of a full-size pair of antlers and skull of this long extinct deer-like animal called the great Irish elk. And the truth is the great Irish elk lived all over Europe and probably well into Asia, parts of Asia, Asia Minor certainly. And it was, I think the largest specimens that have been exhumed were 12 feet wide. My sculpture is just a bit over 11 feet wide. Wow. And they actually lived. And what's extraordinary is to realize that these creatures, like all members of the deer family, grow their antlers anew every year. So every year they would push out this enormous bone growth. And it was the antlers functioned as sexual display for attracting mates, and also occasionally for defense, for fighting. And I think they went extinct many, many years ago. And one of the hypotheses is that they may have their antlers might have just become so large that they no longer could carry the weight, and maybe the landscape changed and it became more forested, and these things became a liability moving through the woods. Who knows? But anyway, so they have been exhumed from peat bogs in Ireland, where they were preserved in the peat. But they believe that they existed all over Europe as well, not just Ireland. But they come to be called the Irish elk, or the great Irish elk.
So the bloated, masculine, aggressive, testosterone-driven elements, which led to its own demise.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a fantastic Seamus Heaney poem that talks about the Irish elk. We should check that out. I forget what it's called.
I have to look.
Yeah. It's a great short poem, which is about the idea of Ireland. Yeah. Last work, people. Sorry, and then we'll get to questions. But it's a very powerful work, I think, and it brings together lots of elements from everything we've been looking at today. This is called A Column for Sally Hemings, 2019, cast iron, painted tulip poplar at the bottom, and it sits straight on the floor there and was installed in the center of the dome of the American Pavilion, as we were talking about previously, like a raised fist, according to Holland Cotter in the New York Times.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that initially I had decided to boycott this this central entry because I didn't like the sort of miniature dome overhead and the kind of sunburst or compass rose imagery on the floor, and the fact that it's such a miniaturized little folly. And I came to grips with it, and I decided that really what I should put here is, it gave rise to a work that was really conceived and created for this space. And it's a column dedicated to Thomas Jefferson's slave, one of his slaves, a woman named Sally Hemings, who for many years, Jefferson scholars denied the rumors that had been circulating during Jefferson's lifetime, that he had fathered children with a slave. And Jefferson scholars for many, many years said this was impossible. Jefferson was far too erudite, cultivated, a man to ever sink so low as to sleep with a slave. And recent evidence has, DNA evidence, has shown that that this is not only possible, but not only was it possible, but it's highly, highly likely. And now when you go to visit Monticello in Virginia, Jefferson's home that he designed in this style of architecture, this kind of Palladian style, you will hear the docents acknowledge Jefferson's paternity of Sally Hemings' children. And you'll be shown where she possibly might have lived in Monticello. And the story is so interesting when you realize that Sally Hemings was family in a very real sense. After Jefferson's wife died, her name was Martha Wales Jefferson. After she died, the story is that Jefferson vowed that he wouldn't ever marry again. He did go to Paris as a diplomat, and I think the story is that he took one of his slaves as a nursemaid to his children, and that was Sally Hemings. It turns out that Sally Hemings was, in fact, I said she was family. She was Thomas Jefferson's deceased wife's half-sister. In other words, Martha Wales' father, John Wales, had fathered Sally Hemings, as well as Thomas Jefferson's own wife. And so he was marrying his wife's half-sister. He was not marrying her, but he began to have a relationship with his deceased wife's half-sister, who was his property, was a slave. And the belief is that he had fathered as many as 6 children with her. So it was a protracted relationship, if it happened. And evidence is that it did. And it's just an interesting story about family and how this kind of binary way that we have divided our society. And in fact, we are much more family than we ever want to admit. Right. And the fact that Sally Hemings was not a Black African phenotypically. She was the daughter of what would be called then a mulattress or a quadroon, a woman who was, Sally herself was a quadroon in the parlance of the day. She was 1/4 Black, but her mother was also a mulatto, mixed race, from a previous miscegenation. So this happened all the time. And it's something that our country still is coming to grips with. And the fact is, I think that my personal view is that we talk about this kind of binary way of dividing our society between Black and white. And I think the reality is much closer to being the case where the Black Americans are a mixed race population. We are mixed race people. And you look at any group of Black people and you'll see a range of phenotypes, some of whom could pass for white if they choose to stay in the race. They could conceivably pass for Caucasian, down to all to people who look like they could have stepped off a boat from Senegal or Zambia. And, so there's a whole kind of crazy way that we think about race in this country. This incredibly binary way that we think about something that's so complex. And I'll say also that I think that race in America is a euphemism for something that's far more difficult to talk about, which is caste. It's a caste system that we deal with here. And race is the marker. It's a caste marker. And it's a euphemism.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is her column carved out of tulip poplar. And you can see here that the flutes, as it tapers upward in its entasis, which is an element of classical design, the flutes flow upward and then they go down, they get driven into the center by this iron stake with a shackle, similar to the shackle on Big Bling. It's all cast iron, massive cast iron.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary form because of the way that it's sort of pushing into it. I mean, in the same way that the sculpture in the through that volute from the monstrance in the front, you have the same element where it's almost like the column is folding in to itself, kind of radical structure, and an extraordinary way to dedicate something to this woman who was raped at 14 and and was who was property owned, and who was not the type of person who typically would receive a monument. And when I was looking at these photographs of the installation of the column for Sally Hemings, I was thinking about everything we're going through right now in Britain and in this country, public monuments, citing monuments, etc. On the right is Udall's great statue of George Washington, which was installed in the rotunda of the Virginia State Capitol, which of course was designed by Thomas Jefferson. And that idea, which seems enlightened, of replacing a statue of the deity, a cult statue of a god, with a statue of Washington as a civilian farmer, but also with the tools of his military trade behind him, and with that kind of columnar form, new gods for old in a sense, in the center of a building dedicated to democracy. And then here you have this wonderful image of this sculpture that you've made in this dome, which was built in 1930s, flexing its muscle, America post-World War II, post-World War I, on the verge of yet another world war. And I'm thinking about it with respect to, everything that's going on right now, this controversy over Mark Quinn's sculpture of Jen Reed, which was installed in Bristol on the plinth where the statue of the slaver Edward Colston had been installed, which was torn down by protesters last month and thrown into the river. And a lot of artists who have weighed in about that, like Thomas J. Price and Larry Sainty Akiampong on Instagram, about how Mark Quinn's action is an effrontery in terms of a white artist replacing this sculpture with something, even though it celebrates the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of things going on. And I think that you've successfully managed to make something which has a real power and feels new in this kind of space, and is very complicated. All of these debates are complicated, but let me just say that I'm glad that you installed something in the rotunda in the end in Venice.
Yeah.
It makes a real statement.
It's right under the dome. It's right in the sort of center of the entire complex, the focus.
Yeah, it became that, I guess. And I also think it's extraordinary that at the same time that you had this installation in Venice, of course, Carol Walker has had her great fountain, Fons Americanus, in Tate Modern, and this sort of complicated idea of America by two our greatest living sculptors in Europe, I think is a really powerful statement in the wake of the disastrous Trump presidency. So let's move to questions, Martin, because people are really waiting, and we've taken a long time, but I want to just say, I really appreciate you opening up about so many of these things and talking about these things, and that people, you can, even if you're social distancing in New York City, you can see a work by Martin. If you ride your bike or walk down to the North Battery Park City, and you can see the North Cove pylons, which were installed in 1995. They're very beautiful any time of day. But thank you so much for this talk, Martin, and I hope you have some energy for some questions.
Thank you both so much, Martin. There's so much content to chew on with this talk. We've had a really beautiful show of community in the comments. Also, a lot of your former students are here from SAIC in the 80s and elsewhere. So this should be really interesting. Our first question is from Jare Das from Nigeria, who requested that I read their question. But they're in the chat right now. The question from Jare is, I was curious to know if Martin could speak of the wood carving techniques he learned during his time in Sierra Leone and the influence this has had on his process of working with wood or just sculpting in general.
Well, I said earlier that I'm not much of a carver. I can carve, I have done some carving, but what I saw in Sierra Leone, which was interesting to me, was woodworkers, what were at the time called cabinet makers or carpenters, were making furniture without any machinery, without any electricity. And I saw people cutting joints and sawing boards and planing boards and putting boards together. And I think that might have been more formative than actually anything I might have seen. I didn't actually see much in the way of carving, in the sense of carving solid masses of wood, tree trunks or chunks of wood into sculptures. And I didn't see any of the production of what we celebrate in this country of African sculpture, which typically is masks and smaller figurines. I certainly saw enough of that. People would bring us, as Peace Corps volunteers, we would be offered carvings and masks by traders, but I never saw the actual production of those items. But I did get very involved in working with local carpenters and learning some of the trade that, in fact, we had, the school I taught at was adding one class or one grade every year. We started with the first form, it was called, and we added a new grade every year until we had a fully fledged school. And during the school year, we had the furniture, the doors, the desks, the chairs were being made at a cabinet shop down the road from the school. And so I was watching the furniture and everything that the school needed for the next class of kids being produced in this cabinet shop, and I got very involved. I worked with them, and we exchanged things. I had made guitars, and before I'd gone to the Peace Corps, and I showed one of the head carpenter. He was interested in making a guitar, so we made guitars together, and I watched and worked a little bit with his young carpenters and learned a lot about using woodworking techniques that didn't rely on power tools because there's no electricity. So I hope that answers your question.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Our next question comes from our very own Everett. Everett, you should be able to ask your question now.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is, I spent the past 5 years taking a break from my sculpture practice, deciding instead to accept the limited space I had access to in New York City and make drawings. And here I am now in Connecticut during COVID with a small patch of grass to make sculpture on and 5 years worth of drawings. But I'm having trouble translating one to the other. I know that to some degree drawing is part of your practice. I was wondering if you could share with me what connection drawing has to sculpture, either generally or more particular to your own work.
Well, I can't generalize about it, except to say that for me, drawing is usually a tool. It's usually not an end, and I don't make a lot of finished drawings. I often use drawings as a way to understand what I want to do and to understand how to do something, but I haven't been in the habit, unfortunately, and I love to draw, but in general, I'm much more in a rush to put my hands on something physical and make something. So I don't spend a huge amount of time drawing beyond what I need to understand what it is I'm going to make. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Okay.
Our next question is coming straight from the chat. It's from M. Joseph. M, I'm going to turn on your microphone right now. Stay tuned.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for being here and for everything you've shared today. Can you speak about the fire that took place in your studio in the 70s and what the experience was like of losing all of your work in one fell swoop and kind of how you recovered from that experience? I also know there's an essay that you wrote about that, and I'm wondering if it is available anywhere.
An essay. Wow, I don't remember writing an essay. I may have spoken about it at length because it certainly was a big event in my life. Yeah, I was living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, before it became the Williamsburg it is today, and had a very primitive kind of loft situation, which caught fire from the ground floor up and just went through the building, 4 floors, like a chimney. And I was in Washington, D.C. teaching at the time. I came back the next day and saw everything I owned charred. So it was there are a lot of ways a lot of parts to this story, but I'd been thinking of ways to get out of New York anyway, and so this was this kind of made the decision. I had been living in New York for 4 years by then, and 3 of those years I was teaching at the University of Maryland, commuting, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., and I was commuting back and forth every week. It was killing me, and I was not gaining any traction in New York City as far as finding places to exhibit my work that I felt worthy of my work. And I was thinking of a way to relocate someplace else. And this fire made the decision made the decision for me in a sense. It was also, I felt it was important to try to find something positive about it. And I did, in that I felt that it was a chance for me to do something that we don't often get to do, which is completely recalibrate your life. And so that's what I did. And I think I set up some kind of new notion of priorities for myself to move forward. And uh, yeah, it was a watershed event. It's kind of like what we're going through with this coronavirus, I think. I think this is going to be a watershed event for everybody who survives it, who's living through it. We're never going to forget what it was like to do this. But I survived, and I feel very fortunate that I did. I mean, the good news was that I didn't lose all my work. I had some work in a part of the loft that was a little bit separate from the main building, the main space. And that work was received some smoke damage, but no structural damage. And that was sort of the beginnings of a continuation of my work. I had those 3 or 4 pieces that I clung to, and I began to start from there to rebuild my life.
Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you, Em, for your question. We have such a beautiful depth of so many questions from the audience. Scott Lerner, Catherine Kraft, Maria Safioti Dale, many more, but because we're rounding the 2-hour mark, if it's all right with you, Martin, I'd love to go to our poet of the day.
Oh, so we've been on for 2 hours?
We have, it flew right by.
Oh my God.
Is that all right? I think Kwame has some verses for us.
Well, that's great. That's great.
Right. And if it's fine, I'll send the question to you at a later date via email. So we have a tradition at the Rail here of ending lunch with a poem, and luckily we've carried these into our community events. So today I'm thrilled to welcome the poet Kwame Opoku-Duku III to the stage. Before he reads a few poems for us, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Kwame Opoku-Duku is a Ghanaian-American poet and fiction writer. He is the author of the Unbound Verses, which came out through Glass Poetry Press, and his work is featured in the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Kenyon Review, Bomb, Apogee, many other publications. Kwame lives in New York City, where he's an educator, a founding member of the Unbound Collective, and where he also curates the reading series Dear Ocean. Kwame?
Thank you very much for that, that introduction. Mr. Puryear, that was such a wonderful talk. And I'm so honored to be a part of this. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. Especially the Slavery Memorial at Brown University just really shook me to my core to hear you speak about it. And I wanted to read a poem that I felt kind of spoke to that to an extent, both acknowledging the history and the effects of slavery and white supremacy and caste, and then also trying to, through whatever will make it through that and look forward to better things. So this poem is called They'll Ask You Where It Hurts the Most. Blessed be the bitterness at your core, that quiet light growing quieter still, like the dull moan that escapes your lips while you dream. They'll ask you, child, what you know of suffering. They'll ask you where it hurts the most, when the pain changes like wavelengths of light in the evening sky, when the cries of the ancestors ring out to you from the ocean, when their words vibrate in your diaphragm like a listless, queenless hive. You may forever, child, feel a type of way, but you must get up every morning and watch the sunrise from the ocean. Remember to love your lover. Remember the goodness and righteousness of deep red against her skin, the color of the ocean on her toenails. Remember the ancestors who praised the gods at the sight of land. One day, child, you will join them on a beach in Accra, where you'll pour out libations for those who have yet to come. Until then, stand with your arms stretched toward the sky, and though termites may eat you from within, pray to grow into a wise old tree. for the dignity to praise alone the sun and the rains. Pray to become a garden, to distinguish that which nourishes us from that which keeps us alive. And I will just read one more poem. And thank you again, everyone, for your questions. Mr. Puryear, you're amazing. Thank you. This poem is called The Department of the Gods, River Bureau. And what we need to know about this poem is that in January of 2018, local chiefs reported that the river god had banned menstruating girls from crossing the River Ofen, which forms a boundary between the Ashanti region and central regions of Ghana. And according to the BBC, the ban would prohibit the girls from attending classes because it's necessary to cross the river to go to school. And it was just something that just didn't really sit well with me. My sister does work in Ghana specifically to empower girls, and especially when it comes to schools and certain traditions that are harmful to women, and anyone who's really not invested in the patriarchy. So with that being said, this poem is called The Department of the Gods, River Bureau. We go out into the bush alone. We go mad with holy. Trembling like children emerge from water running into the sun. The only thing holier than word is blood. To belong to the river is to belong to the infinite, is to call it a god. And to the river, every child's cry is a psalm. If the gods do exist, may all bodies tremble the same. Men lie while holy about so many things. We tell lies about children, let the water baby sing. This is our block. We can make as much noise as we want, keep talking all that mess, and see what happens when our mama gets back. That's it for me. Thank you very much again for having me. It's been an absolute joy.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kwame. And thank you, Martin and Jason. Aggie Gund also sends her love to both of you. I've been instructed to pass that along. And I wanted to give a shout out and a thank you to everyone who came out today, everyone who's in the chat, everyone who asked such brilliant questions. Thank you so much. You're so appreciated. You can now turn on your microphones and say goodbye as you leave, or whatever you'd like, really. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Oh,
Jason.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Jason.
It's a beautiful poem.
Martin.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Candida, thanks for coming. Quincy, thanks for being here.
Here.
Thank you. Thank you to my parents.
To Jason's parents.
Yes, my mom's still awake.
Jason's parents.
Eileen Rosenfeld, hello.
Scotty J.
Hey, that's what's his name?
Thank you,
Hey,
Martin.
Martin, I'm amazed that I'm amazed that you didn't realize it was 2 hours.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Pong. All right, Pong.
That was awesome. That was incredible.
Joy Robbins.
Thank you, Candida. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. It was
Fantastic. Great to see everyone.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Amy, coming from the Netherlands.
Cheers to Tom Niskowski.
Thanks.
Tom Niskowski. Yes.
Yes.
All your thoughts.
Everyone have a drink for Tom Niskowski
Yeah.
later tonight.
I'll do that.
Joyce.
Great
Hi,
man.
Joyce.
Paint to paint.
Everyone except Scotty.
Yes, I
So good.
And you guys, thank you for the beautiful reading also. Thank you so much. Much love and love.
Yeah, Kwame, that was amazing.
That was Kwame, very beautiful.
Amazing.
So
Tough
touching.
reading.
Yes, very touching.
Moving. Very touching. So
All right.
Martin, thank you so much from everybody. That was fabulous.
And happy birthday to William T. Williams.
Oh, it's my birthday too. That's
Happy birthday to Quincy.
Happy birthday!
And William T. Williams share a birthday.
I had a Martin Puryear themed birthday party.
Happy birthday!
Wow.